This is the third episode in the podcast, but the second in our series on the pleasant, uplifting, delightful topic of anthropic allophages. That's a term that I've coined for human cannibals because that just wasn't pretentious enough. I know this is an extreme topic. I'm just going to answer, why in a podcast that is claiming to try to help us understand who we are, why would you choose such an extreme, marginal, aberrant topic in order to help us understand who we are? And I get that criticism. To some extent, I think it's founded and well-grounded. And I think a fair thing to point out and question. Because a lot of people would argue that it is not now, and it never has been normal to eat another member of your own species. But for one thing, I don't really know that it is all that abnormal. As I've been researching this topic, there's just case after case in regions separated by vast distances and also through eons of time. So my first response would be, I'm not so sure that cannibalism is as deviant and marginal as we'd like to believe. There's just too much evidence of it being practiced in ritualistic contexts, religious contexts. It turns up in a broad number of motifs, everything from Greek mythology to German fairy tales. So I'm just not sure I can agree with the criticism that this is a marginal, extreme, kind of sensationalist topic, for one thing. Another thing is I think that it is a topic that has some direct benefits to our discussion. The first is that this is a topic that is shocking enough that the visceral reaction we get to the strong images around this topic, that it really can help focus our attention. It can drive us to go look in the mirror and wonder who that is looking back at us. And with that, I think the questions that it makes us ask are, by their very nature, interesting questions. So on today's episode, unfortunately, after that long screed, we're more in the condition of a physician who comes into the room with a comatose patient who cannot answer any questions about what's going on with them. Because by very definition, the topics we're going to be talking about have no written records. We're going to be talking about primate, protohuman, and prehistoric cannibalism. So with these topics, there's obviously no historical record. So I guess it's good in a sense because we don't have to worry about anybody lying to us or having an agenda. Because the only way this history is going to be told is in the observations of naturalists, in the bones that have been recovered, which layers of sediment they're recovered from, the radiocarbon dating, DNA testing, and microscopic analysis and other physical findings. That's the way this history is going to be told. And I'm just going to tell you right at the outset that I think the picture that emerges is fairly consistent. And I hate to say it, but I think it's overwhelmingly obvious that we are a cannibalistic species. And yes, that's maybe under certain conditions only. But in this episode, we are going to learn that our closest primate relatives, the genus Homo, are cannibals. We're going to learn that our genetic precursors were cannibals. And we're also going to learn that our own species, people who shared our anatomy and our physiology in the time before history, were cannibals. And when you look at the cumulative weight of that evidence, you have to say, okay, that's part of who we are, that's part of our DNA. And if, after hearing all of the evidence, you still want to maintain the position that cannibalism is highly unnatural for our species, then I would just simply ask you this: when did that happen? What year did that happen? When was this weeded out of our gene pool? And of course, I'm not talking about the ethics or the cultural norms, because obviously it has been weeded out of our societies. Cannibalism is considered immoral to the point of depravity by almost every society on Earth today. And I believe there are very good reasons for that, which we'll get into when we talk about the ethics a little bit more. But I'll just close this little introduction with this point. After studying primate, protohuman, and prehistoric cannibalism, I think it's pretty clear that we need to keep laws against it on the books, because it is something that we are not incapable of as a species. And so with that, I'm going to begin our discussion of primate, protohuman, and prehistoric cannibalism with the discussion of primates. Now, this is not a primatology podcast, so I'm going to confine my discussion to the closest of our close relatives, the hominids, the so-called great apes, the family that Homo sapiens belongs to. And of all the different species that have come and gone in that family over the eons of time, there are 4 extant genera that are still on the earth at this time today. The first one is Pongo, which is the orangutans. Then there's Pan, which includes the chimpanzees and bonobos. Then there's Gorilla, which you can guess what they are. And then, of course, there's us, the genus Homo. And we have learned a lot about our hominid relatives in the last 25 years. Because as of 1992, Hiraiwa Hasegawa performed a comprehensive meta-analysis of all of the data regarding the 8 species of great apes living on the planet. And out of those 8 species, in those 4 genera that we talked about, researchers had found evidence of cannibalism in only 2. One of those was the common chimpanzee, and the other was the mountain gorilla. And Dr. Hasegawa also tried to answer the question of why this cannibalism was practiced among primates. And from all of the evidence that he had, both in the chimpanzees and in the mountain gorillas, it was his belief that it was practiced merely for the obtaining of food. It was for nutrition. It was not for any social reasons whatsoever. It was not trying to get the females ready to mate again. It was not a display of dominance or terrorizing something. It was simply a matter of getting calories and protein into your body. Which is very interesting because cannibalism was only noted to be practiced on infant chimpanzees, among the chimpanzee examples. They didn't eat adult chimpanzees. Even when they would go to war and kill other chimpanzees that were adults, they would not eat them. Which does beg the question of why it would be a simple nutritional matter. Obviously, an adult, a full-size chimpanzee, would have more calories and more protein, more calcium, everything, than an infant. So why did they only consume the infants? Of course, I already mentioned that our understanding has changed a lot since 1992. And now you can add orangutans to that list of great ape cannibals. In 2009, Delatorre et al. Published a report of 2 Sumatran orangutan females who consumed their dead infants. Now, they do point out that these were 2 very poor mothers. They had several offspring, most of which died. And these were apparently 2 orangutans who had been re-released into the wild after having been in captivity, and who knows what stresses and trauma they were subjected to. So the thought was that this was very rare behavior, and actually was aberrant behavior for an orangutan. And just a little personal note here, I personally have witnessed aberrant behavior by an orangutan under conditions of stress, so I know what they're capable of. I can still remember it very vividly. I was a little kid. I went to see this cute monkey, which turned out to be an orangutan. And it was a female, and she kept just doing disgusting things. Oh, man. She would like play in her feces and smell her fingers, and then she peed on the floor and started drinking it, and just other things that are just too indecent to even mention. But I realized later that this was an animal who was living her life in a very unnatural, highly stressful environment, a very small cage in isolation. And so it seems very possible that the behaviors of these cannibal mother orangutans were informed by these same types of stress. Maybe a little bit more discouraging and deflating is the fact that now everybody's favorite sexy hippie apes, the bonobos, those matriarchal, peace-loving, solve-all-problems-with-sex apes, have now been caught in the act of cannibalism. This was observed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A female bonobo named Olga had 2 daughters, and one of the daughters died when she was about 3 years old, so making her still very young. And the scientists who observed this did not think that she was killed for food. She died of natural causes, but they did observe up to 8 members of that same troop consuming this infant over the course of several hours. They said it took them 7.5 hours to consume her, and they passed her around among the whole troop, sharing her in true communal bonobo fashion. It was very strange behavior. It had not really been witnessed among wild bonobos before this time. And it's strange on a couple of counts. The first is, why were 8 members of the troop involved in consuming this baby bonobo? And the second thing that's very strange is, why did they take so long to eat her? And no one really knows the answer to that. It's possible that they found it absolutely disgusting, but nobody wanted to be rude and turn it down. Like that Christmas fruitcake that you try to choke down for half an hour, but you don't want to be rude. But it's also possible that there was some significance, socially or otherwise, to the troop in consuming this child. But I do think it's telling that so many of the members of the troop participated in this. Makes it seem like it's not all that unnatural, even though it has seldom been observed. So much for the bonobos. I've already alluded to the fact that gorillas participated in cannibalism. Those reports come from the 1970s when Dian Fossey, the very famous naturalist whose story would be a good podcast in its own right. But one of the less glamorous aspects of her work was to examine the scat from different gorillas. And she was examining the feces of a mother and daughter gorilla, and she found the remains of two gorillas, parts from two gorillas, in the feces of this mother and daughter. This was not a witnessed act of cannibalism. She did not see them consuming the two gorillas that she found in their feces, but it was kind of the smoking gun for gorilla cannibalism. And I have to say, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because gorillas are vegetarians, the most strictly vegetarian of the great apes. So it seems to me that for the orangutan and for the gorillas, in particular, you could make a strong case that this was abnormal deviant behavior, very rare and isolated examples. But I don't know if you could consider the bonobo behavior all that deviant, because after all, 8 members of the troop participated, so maybe they're just like mob cannibals. You know how humans get into mobs and start grabbing their torches and pitchforks and tearing everything up. Maybe bonobos also succumb to mob pressure. But I don't know. One thing we do know, though, is that our closest relatives, the bonobos and the chimps, seem to be the most cannibalistic of the great apes. How closely related are we to bonobos and chimpanzees? We share 98.7% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. 98.7. But what is to me even more interesting is that we don't share the exact same 98.7% of our DNA with bonobos that we share with chimpanzees. Some parts of our DNA we share only with bonobos, and some parts of our DNA we share only with chimpanzees. And after studying them just a little bit, I think I figured out what those parts are. I think we share our egalitarian, matriarchal, peace and love pot-smoking genes with the bonobos. And we get our jingoistic, gun-loving, patriarchal, cocaine-snorting genes from the chimpanzee side. It's obvious. I don't know how you could possibly refute that. So scientists are going to catch up to my theory in a while. You wait and see. Chimpanzees are much more warlike than bonobos. In fact, an adult male chimp is a fearsome animal, a very, very dangerous animal. They're incredibly strong and powerful. They're very aggressive, and they have teeth that can just rip you apart. And there are news stories that kind of back that up. I mean, these things are like bonobos on bath salts. They develop to hunt, to fight, to kill. They organize themselves into war parties, and they go to war, and they fight and kill other troops of chimpanzees. And chimpanzees are the only great apes, aside from humans, who get a significant portion of their nutrition from eating meat. And their favorite meat, which they hunt the most often, is the red colobus monkey. So eating monkeys is their favorite. But along with this, and maybe partly because of this, they also have a real fondness for a much more disturbing fare, and that is their own infants. Chimpanzees cannibalize their young, not only in troops that they have gone to war with and killed, but in their own troop. They'll cannibalize their own. And it's interesting, they seem not to have much of a taste for adult chimpanzee. When they do go to war and when they kill adults from another troop, they don't eat them. But they do eat the infants. And the thing that I find interesting about that is this, to me, proves that cannibalism among chimpanzees is not primarily driven by the need for calories or nutrition. Because obviously they could eat an adult and get far more nutrition, protein, calories from that than they do from the infants, but they only eat the infants. And it is not just the infants of rival groups that they consume their own, as I said. When Jane Goodall first described this behavior back in 1976, the first episode of chimpanzee cannibalism that she or anybody else had documented was a mother and daughter chimpanzee who hunted, killed, and ate 3 infant chimpanzees. And unlike bonobos and gorillas and orangutans, where this seems to be rare, semi-isolated instances, this behavior has been documented extensively and repeatedly in chimps. It happens all the time. It's just one of the natural vicissitudes of chimpanzee life. Imagine if humans were like chimpanzees. The last thing you'd want to do when you had a baby was send out a birth announcement, send out a picture of that baby. About half the people who saw it start salivating, thinking it looked really tasty. But that's the reality of chimpanzee life. And what's interesting too There is this stereotype of the male chimps cannibalizing the young, but it really isn't, according to the Max Planck Institute researchers. This is a behavior primarily noted in the females. They have documented several times the male chimps trying to defend the infants from the females who are trying to eat them. And this is a contrast with some of the other animals who have been known to eat their young, say polar bears or lions. A male will kill the offspring of the female to get her into heat faster, but that does not happen in chimpanzee tribes. It's really fascinating that a creature with the intelligence of a chimpanzee would participate in a behavior that seems to us so completely senseless, self-defeating, kind of counterproductive, as eating their own young. So you have to wonder if it's just some kind of weird evolutionary glitch that has yet to be weeded out of their gene pool, or if it serves some purpose, some survival purpose. Because it seems to me that during times of famine, stress, scarcity, that raising an infant chimp might be too costly. It might put too great of a burden upon the mother, who is, after all, the one feeding it, the one carrying it around with her everywhere, the one defending it from other chimpanzees. And in those conditions, infanticide might confer some survival advantage on them. Well, with that, I'm going to leave our survey of cannibalism among the great apes. I'm not going to get into individual witnessed accounts because they're just no fun. They're too disturbing. Really no redeeming value. Just suffice it to say that our nearest genetic relatives have been documented participating in cannibalism. And among chimpanzees, who have 98.7% of the same DNA we do, it's a way of life. So with that, I'm going to move on to cannibalism among protohumans. And by protohumans, what I'm going to be talking about are archaic members of the genus Homo, hominids that are now extinct. The best known and the best documented of these, of course, are the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. But there's also Homo rhodesiensis, Homo heidelbergensis, or a controversial one, the little hobbit man from Indonesia, Homo floresiensis. Or going back further still, we have Homo antecessor, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. Seems like there's too many of these for me to name. And that's not even going back at all into the Australopithecus or Ardipithecus or other species. So the earliest evidence that we have of cannibalism among protohumans goes way, way, way back. This is amazing. 800,000 years to a cave in Spain called Grandolina. Fairly recent research from like 2009, 2010 studied the fossil bones and came to the conclusion that cannibalism was just a normal part of everyday life for Homo antecessor. And Homo antecessor is the precursor for both Neanderthals and humans. But in this cave Grandolina, they found the bones of bison, deer, wild sheep, other animals. And along with that, they discovered the butchered remains of 11 Homo antecessor children and adolescents. The bones had been smashed to get to the marrow inside. There was evidence that the victims' brains may also have been eaten. There were strike marks on the bone at the base of the skull. The bones had been struck with a rock trying to enter the cranial cavity. And one of the researchers, whose name was Bermudez de Castro, kind of deadpanned, quote, "Probably then they cut the skull for extracting the brain. The brain is good for food." It's pretty laconic considering the subject matter. All of these youth and adolescent bones didn't just come from one episode either. It was not a mass killing. The ages of the bones varied by as much as 100,000 years. So this is something that went on over vast periods of time. And the fact that they just took these bones and threw them into the pit with all the other animal bones was clear indication also to the researchers that this was not something that was done in a ritualistic fashion either. They were just food, like any other food. So there you have evidence of cannibalism among Homo antecessor, as I said, the precursor to both modern humans and Neanderthals. And their descendants continued their dietary preferences, I guess you could say, because Neanderthals and humans actually lived together, they sometimes slept together, and sometimes they ate each other. But more to the point in this series, Neanderthals were cannibals. They ate their own kind. I'm going to refer to one study from 2006 as an example of this. And I'm citing an article from Live Science from December 4, 2006 by Andrea Thompson. It says, Neanderthals suffered periods of starvation and may have supplemented their diet through cannibalism, according to a study of remains from northwest Spain. Paleobiologists studied samples from 8 43,000-year-old Neanderthal skeletons excavated from an underground cave in El Cedrón, Spain, since 2000. Researchers found cut marks and evidence that bones had been torn apart. There's strong evidence suggesting that these Neanderthals were eaten, said the study's lead author, Antonio Rosas. That is, long bones and the skull were broken for extraction of the marrow. Here he goes again, which is very nutritious. But according to this lead researcher, Rosas, cannibalism was actually general among the Neanderthal populations in Europe. But researchers have enough evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism that they can learn some very interesting things about it. What they've done is they look at the layers of enamel in the teeth, and these are somewhat like tree rings. They grow by adding concentric layers. And also like tree rings, you can see periods of dramatic growth and periods where there was very little growth whatsoever. During periods of starvation, minimal nutrition, teeth do not grow, the rings do not grow very much. And the bones of cannibalized Neanderthals almost uniformly show very, very minimal growth in these layers of enamel around the time that they were cannibalized. And from this, scientists are able to discern that these were periods of extreme famine or hardship or hunger. That Neanderthal was not the chosen diet of Neanderthals, but they resorted to it much like the Jamestown colonists did, when they had to. What about the evidence of cannibalism among prehistoric humans, people who had our anatomy, our physiology, our DNA? In other words, they had the same nature as us, but who lived in very, very different times. They had a very different nurture, different societies, different mores, different stresses, different technologies. How did they behave? Well, here we have extensive evidence that they practiced cannibalism not just for ritual purposes, not just for religious purpose, not just for nutritional purposes, but for all of the above. I'm going to talk about 2 sites only with this because there are too many to even begin to cover all over the world. There is extensive, and some would say incontrovertible evidence that we were cannibals. Now there are a few holdouts, a few cranks out there who deny it, but that's a fringe position, that's a marginal position. Because like I said, the evidence is just too overwhelming. I'm only going to cover 2 sites. The first that I want to talk about is Gough's Cave in southern England, near a town called Cheddar, which I would assume is where our cheddar cheese comes from. And there's a cave in a gorge that's 115 meters deep and runs on for over 2 miles in length. And for a long time people just thought it was a sand hole, but then a man named Richard Gough in 1892 through 1898 excavated the cave and opened it to the public, and so that's why the cave is named after him. But it's very clear that prehistoric humans inhabited and used this cave as a place to live and to feast, because there are the bones of many, many different species of animals, all of which contain the characteristic and well-known marks of animal butchery. And along with that, they found human remains which belonged to 5 or 7 people, including a 3-year-old child and 2 adolescents, and all of these had cut marks and breakage consistent with something that had been defleshed and possibly eaten. And some of the skulls had been turned into ornaments called skull cups. But this is where it gets interesting, because when researchers come across the butchered remains of humans, they have to make a decision. They have to decide whether or not these humans were butchered in the way of animals to be used as a feast, or if they were somehow stripped of their flesh in some strange burial ritual. And these can present difficulties of interpretation for anthropologists. So for example, imagine that you had uncovered remains of human beings found in the feces of condors and vultures in Tibet, and you might assume that these were man-eating vultures, and that human meat was a part of their natural diet. It wouldn't be that easy if you didn't have some historical information to realize that this was part of a ritual burial called the sky burial. And in a similar fashion, you can't tell just by looking at a bone, you can't prove absolutely that these cut and scratch marks, the breakage to get to the marrow, was really part of a cannibalistic ritual. Several options present themselves. One is they could be feeding the meat to animals. They could be stripping the bones of flesh and then burning the flesh in a form of cremation. You just don't know based on those cut marks. So in Gough's Cave, they found the remains of 5 to 7 people. And they concluded that this was an example of either cannibalism or just the removal of flesh from the bones after death, which may be a ritual that these people had participated in. But in 2016, a study was published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, which tried to determine which of those two scenarios was the truth. Was it butchery for eating? Was it ritualistic? And the team that published this paper was led by Sylvia Bello from the Natural History Museum in London. She explained that cannibalism and ritualistic defleshing can be distinguished based on the frequency, the distribution, and the characteristics of the cut marks. And I'm going to quote her from an article in ancientorigins.net. Quote, "Cannibalized human remains present a uniform cut mark distribution which can be associated with disarticulation of persistent and labile articulations and the scalping and filleting of muscles. For secondary burials where modification occurred after a period of decay, disarticulation marks are less common and the disarticulation of labile joints is rare." Okay, what did all that mean? Well, for one thing, when a corpse has been allowed to decay and then is disarticulated, there are joints that are labile, they're unstable. They become very easy to just pull apart, and so there's no reason to disarticulate them with a sharp cutting tool. So for these researchers, evidence of sharp cutting tools being used to disarticulate a joint is strong evidence that they were butchered immediately after death. There's another factor, and that is that in ritualistically disarticulated and defleshed bones, there is often a pattern carved into the bones, a very specific pattern that has ritualistic significance, and there was none of that in the bones in Gough's cave. In other words, people tend to decorate the dead when they are burying them ritualistically, and that did not occur in Gough's cave. And another piece of strong evidence that these human remains were butchered for food is if the way that they are butchered is exactly the same as the way that the animals around them had been butchered for food. And that was the case in Gough's cave. The human skeletons had not been treated any differently in the way that they were disarticulated, cut up, and disposed of than the animal remains in the vicinity. So all of that evidence points to the fact, the strong suspicion that something pretty terrifying was happening in Gough's cave, at least for the victims. The team concludes this, quote, "It is quite symptomatic. You can see the same type of pattern on the other animals. You can really say they were butchering the animals in the same way for the meaty bits," said Bello. "Some of the modification, particularly for the fingers, showed they were probably chewing to suck the grease off. Presence of human tooth marks on human bones is probably the best evidence of cannibalism." I mean, imagine that. You're studying these remains and you find human bones bitten by human teeth. And you have to talk about these finger bones with this clinical detachment, saying some of the modification, particularly for the fingers, shows they were probably chewing to suck the grease off. I mean, how do you say that with a straight face? It reminds me of a novel I read from Stephen King and Peter Straub called Black House. There was a character in that novel called the Fisherman, who was a terrifying, sadistic, fictional creation from the minds of King and Straub, designed specifically to terrorize us. But here, that's exactly what they're saying happened in Gough's cave 14,700 years ago. It's like the rats in the walls from H.P. Lovecraft. The only mitigating factor of all this horror is the fact that they do believe that the bones show no evidence of violence. These were probably people who had died naturally during a time of starvation or famine or disease. But there is very little dispute that this is a site where cannibalism was practiced. But I'm going to end this episode with something that is much more controversial, for many reasons, and they're not all scientific reasons. It is called the Great Anasazi Cannibal Debate. And this debate began back in the 1970s with the work of an archaeologist named Christy Turner. And Turner had examined the evidence of bones left at sites in the Four Corners region, at sites dating between about AD 900 and AD 1250, and he had found over 30 examples of brutalized human remains that he thought had been cannibalized. He published a series of scientific papers, but also in 1999 he published a book with the somewhat ear-catching and inflammatory title, Man-Corn. And here he draws his own picture of what was actually occurring. People were being systematically butchered and eaten, and their remains were being tossed aside like just so many animal remains, just like the bones in Gough's cave. And this was, of course, shocking to the archaeological world, and also highly offensive to the descendants of these Anasazi people, who did not want to see their ancestors as practicing cannibalism. I don't know why that would be a touchy subject for them, except for the stigma associated with being quote-unquote savages and being classified in so many demeaning ways by white settlers over time, when they saw their ancestors as being peace-loving farmers who had attained a high degree of civilization. It's interesting to contrast that with the people in the town of Cheddar, England. Some of those people have been genetically linked to bones that have been discovered in Gough's Cave. But far from being outraged at the suggestion that their distant ancestors practiced cannibalism, they kind of celebrate it. Seems to be a way to bring in tourist dollars, I guess. But the modern-day Pueblo Indians who are descendants of the Anasazi do not celebrate that. They do not believe that it is part of their history, and so there has been a great deal of controversy around Turner's work. So much so that in 2001, there was an entire symposium, which was, quote, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Social Violence in the Pre-Hispanic American Southwest, end quote. But the truth was, this was a whole conference about the C word, cannibalism, and anthropologists were going to slug it out over whether or not the Anasazi were practicing cannibalism. Boy, I wish I could have attended this conference. This would not have been the usual dry academic fare. There was a lot of emotion around this topic. But Turner presented a fairly strong defense of his interpretation of these bones as evidence of cannibalism. He said there are 6 criteria for determining whether or not human remains have been cannibalized. Breakage of the bones, as we talked about, people would break the long bones to try to get at the marrow. Cut marks, in other words, marks that show the bones had been stripped of their flesh using a sharp instrument. Abrasions from being smashed against an anvil. Burning of the bones, meaning that they had been cooked. Missing vertebrae, and I'm not sure what the significance of missing vertebrae was, but also what he called pot polish, bones that had been polished by being boiled and stirred in a pot. And he found ample evidence of all 6 of these criteria on the bones that he had been studying from these different sites in the Anasazi region, around 1000 AD, roughly. But there are some interesting contrary theories. One is from a J. Andrew Darling, who's from the Gila River Indian community in southwestern Arizona. He thinks the entire picture of these bones paints the picture of witch executions. So apparently there was a great fear of witches among the Anasazi, just like there is now in certain regions in modern Africa. But J. Andrew Darling has researched the folklore of modern Pueblo tribes, and he found that killing witches could be a reasonable explanation for the violence that is evident in these bones. It was believed that for witches to lose their power, others would have to cut the body up until they found the location of what's called the evil heart of the witch. And that could be anywhere from the head to the big toe. And dismembering the witch would have been the only way to prevent the witch from taking vengeance on its killer. So that's a very interesting theory. And according to Darling, the systematic dismemberment, disarticulation, and immolation of the skeletons could be evidence that this was a witch killing. I have to say, though, this archaeologist, Andrew Darling, kind of lends credence to Turner's theory because he says witches were the only people among the Anasazi who would have practiced cannibalism. So that could also explain why there were some cannibalized bones near these sites of witch killings. But it seems to me that one of his points dramatically weakens the other. I mean, he goes to say that there was no cannibalism among the Anasazi. These were actually witch killings. But there was cannibalism among the Anasazi practiced by witches. So I'm not really sure how you could hold both positions except to deny that witches were Anasazi in the first place, which they obviously were. So it seems to me that by admitting that there was the population of witches that would eat people, Dr. Darling is kind of agreeing with Dr. Turner that these could be butchered bones of cannibalized Anasazi. But his point was that people are too quick to level an accusation of cannibalism, especially against native or indigenous peoples when they come across these types of remains. And I would submit that that is probably the opposite of the case. I think people are very, very hesitant and very cautious about leveling the accusation of cannibalism against a people. I mean, just witness how hesitant archaeologists were to accept the reports of cannibalism in Jamestown. Tim White, an archaeologist at Berkeley, put it this way, quote, "In the final analysis, many anthropologists are as uncomfortable with cannibalism as creationists are with the fossil record for evolution. Both are likely to remain in denial until they are replaced with a new generation of scientists. Cannibalism has a stigma. Peter Whiteley, an anthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, said this, quote, "Cannibalism is the archetypical sign of otherness. Western culture equates it with folk stories of ogres, the tale of Jack and the Beanstalk, or horror stories like Hannibal the Cannibal. Similarly, modern Hopi folklore tells of flesh-hunting ogres, but they are no more based on reality than Little Red Riding Hood is. Cannibalism in all cultures is seen as a transgression, as a separating good from evil." End of quote. So, in other words, archaeologists realize that there is a ton of baggage associated with concluding that cannibalism was practiced among a people, and that this can be very offensive and divisive. And so far from being quick to level that accusation, they're very, very hesitant. They do so only when the evidence is overwhelming. Because just look at the pushback Dr. Turner has gotten over his theory and over his book Mancorn. He's been accused of promoting racism, ethnocentrism, of being a sensationalist, that he has single-handedly ruined the reputation of the Anasazi as noble people and turned them in the eyes of Western people into bloodthirsty savages, quote-unquote. So I don't know what the truth is. Was it witch killing? Was it a ritual dismemberment of a corpse? Or was it just cannibalism? They wouldn't be the only Native American peoples to have practiced cannibalism, by the way. So I'm not really sure where the evidence leads us. I'd have to leave that to better minds. As far as I understand, most people come down on the side of the fact that this is evidence of cannibalism being practiced among the Anasazi people. But the evidence drops off dramatically after 1200. Around that time, the Anasazi moved out of their main strongholds, their large population centers, and just scattered across the countryside. So it might have been a migration prompted by a major drought, but they don't really know what caused these social upheavals, and we don't really know why there was a series of bones, over 30 sets, as I said, between the time period of AD 900 to 1250 that showed evidence of violence that is not continued or repeated in the archaeological record after that time. But I think it's summed up the best by an archaeologist from Southern Methodist University named Michael Adler. He summed up the debate around whether it was witch killing or cannibalism by saying, quote, "Either way, this is not a happy past," end quote. And I think that is a fitting characterization for the topic of this entire series on anthropic allophages. So next time we'll leave the realms of prehistory and get back to the historical record, and we will talk about stranded cannibals. Thank you for listening to Know Thyself. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. If you want to support the research and the time that goes into the creation of this podcast, I'd appreciate you going to iTunes and giving us a 5-star review. And until next time, I wish you well and a good appetite. Hope I haven't ruined it.